Welcome back, guys. We are working our way through the Cold War now, and we are up to the topic that we're going to describe simply as the Cold War divides the world. So we've covered why the Cold War started. We looked at how it affected areas like China and Korea and Germany and Czechoslovakia and other areas. And we're going to do more kind of a general look today at how the Cold War really divided the entire world into different groups. We're also going to look at a specific example of this. That would be the case of Cuba. So let's jump into this, and we're going to begin by looking at a particular model known as the Three Worlds model. The Three Worlds model. And what that simply means is during the Cold War, we saw a division of the world into basically three spheres, or three groups, or three worlds. There was the first, second, and third worlds, and you can see them mapped out in the blue, the red, and the green. So let's kind of walk through these different worlds. And the first is called, well, simply the First World. And this would refer to the United States and our allies, places like Britain and France and West Germany and Italy, Canada. These would have been the wealthy, industrialized, powerful nations that we kind of identified with. They were countries that had very similar values to ours, shared common goals, and that sort of thing. NATO would have been a key component of the First World. NATO, of course, that military alliance America, formed with Canada and most of the countries of Western Europe after World War II. Now, the term First World is still around, even though the Cold War is long over. The First World today simply refers to the richest, most powerful countries in the world. And you may have heard the term First World problems. These describe problems that really aren't problems outside of rich, powerful countries, where our problems are not real problems, in most of the rest of the world. So the First World was the democratic capitalist world. The Second World, obviously, is going to be the communist world, and this would have been led by the Soviet Union and to a lesser extent China. This would have included Eastern Europe and North Korea and other communist countries scattered across the globe. Then the Third World is really not in either camp. They're kind of in this gray area. Most of them tended to be developing countries. Many of them had just gotten their independence after a long history of being colonized by some outside power. And so they're not necessarily one way or the other. Now, they might have certain leanings. They might be more democratic than communist or vice versa, but they're not really officially in either one of the original camps. Now, when you think of your typical third world country, they would have been in places like Latin America, Asia, and Africa. And these countries tended to be, as I said a moment ago, newly independent, economically developing, poor, tended to be unstable politically, sometimes socially as well. And that idea of these countries being poor is where we get the term third world today to describe countries that struggle, that are not as technologically advanced or as economically stable as countries like, say, the United States or Germany or Norway or whatever country you want to pick in the First World. Now, you have to think about this. Why would the First and Second Worlds be interested in the Third World anyways? And of course, the answer is just this is the Cold War, and you want more friends, and by taking over certain areas and leaving it out of the puzzle, if you will, the other side can't get to those countries. So it's about gaining influence. It's about gaining access to resources. It's about gaining areas where you can build military bases. That's why the Third World was so important to the First and Second World. There are all kinds of different means of gaining influence. That could be spying over them, that could be offering aid to these countries. It could be using propaganda to convince them your way is the best and the other way is not as good. There are lots of different ways. Now, because the Third World is kind of this metaphorical but also sometimes literal battlefield between the First and Second Worlds, you're going to see the First and Second Worlds getting involved in the Third World in means of backing wars. Now, this could be a civil war in a Third World country. This could be a war of revolution. This could be a war of counter-revolution, which just means a revolution against a revolution. And while this all sounds very theoretical right now, we're going to look at an example of this in our next section of the Cold War, the Vietnam War, where there was a communist revolution going on in South Vietnam that the communists were backing, of course, and then there was a war of counter-revolution against that communist revolution that we were backing. So this will all be, real-world stuff here in just a little bit. Now, I mentioned spying a moment ago. Every country has its own spy agency. Probably the most notorious of these during the Cold War would have been the CIA, or Central Intelligence Agency. This is America's premier spying agency. And then almost the Germans, the Russians or Soviets had the KGB. And you can see a young KGB officer right here that you may have heard of. His name is Vladimir Putin, the current president of Russia. And there's all kinds of different means that the spy agencies will use. This could be, surveillance. This could be recruiting people. This could be blackmail against leaders. This could be assassination attempts. There's a lot of tools in their arsenal. Now, another means of trying to gain influence over the third world would be aid, by supplying these people with money, with medicines, with volunteers to help them develop. A good example of this would be the Peace Corps, which was established during the presidency of John F. Kennedy. Its goal was to get young Americans out there in the world and earning friends for America, but also just doing humanitarian work and trying to be, a good neighbor to the rest of the world. Now, if you're a third world country, you may not want to join the first or second worlds. And the reason is obvious. If the first and second world were to go to war, you don't want to get dragged into a war, particularly a war that could go nuclear. So this brings us to something called a non-aligned movement. Not all countries around the world, as I said, wanted to join the first and second, and they were quite happy to sit this out, to be neutral, to be a third party. And you can see a map of the original non-aligned movement members. This will grow to include lots of other countries around the world as well. And some countries also found it convenient to basically play one world off of the other. In other words, they can, basically say, okay, Soviet Union, how much will you give me in aid? And then the Soviet Union will give them a number, and then they'll approach America and say, okay, well, how much will you give me compared to the Soviets? And you can get a better deal if you want to kind of become friends and with one of the other worlds. Even in Europe, there will be countries that were non-aligned. So even in the place where the Cold War is the hottest, the most tense, you're going to see some countries saying, you know what, we don't want to be in the middle of these potential nuclear wars. Now, I said at the beginning that we're going to look at one country in particular today, and that is the country of Cuba. And this is a country that very much would have fit into the third world, right? They were behind, they're economically undeveloped. In the First and Second World, we're very interested in what's going on in Cuba, especially America, because it's only about 90 miles between Key West and Havana. So, what happens in Cuba very much concerns America. And for decades, Cuba had been ruled by a series of dictators, including the most recent, Fulgencio Batista, who was a pretty corrupt, pretty unpopular leader. But we liked him, by we I mean America liked him, because he was not communist. And then in 1959, a revolution occurs in which Batista, our friend in Cuba, was overthrown. And the leader of this revolution was a relatively young man, only 33 at the time. His name was Fidel Castro. There's Fidel Castro. He was the leader of Cuba all the way up until his death in 2016, I believe it was, 2017, something like that. Not that long ago, in other words. This is his brother Raul Castro, who's still alive and still very prominent in Cuban politics today. Another example of one of these revolutionaries in the Cuban Revolution of note would be Che Guevara. Che Guevara was not Cuban; he was from Argentina, but he was a communist, Marxist revolutionary who fought in the Cuban Revolution. And this picture of him is actually pretty famous. You may have seen it in posters or T-shirts or whatever. It's a very, very famous photograph. All right, so what happens to Cuba once Castro's in charge is he's going to bring about a series of reforms. Okay, he's going to improve schools. He's going to improve health care. He's going to grant equality for women. So there are some positives, But that's the case with almost every dictator. There are always a few things you could point to that say, hey, they did some good things. Sure, but they also did some horrible things. Okay, Castro was not a believer in democracy. He executed his critics. He put people in jail. There was censorship all over the place. People really were very much ruled over very harshly by their government in Cuba. And they still are today. Cuba is still a communist country. Now, we weren't quite sure what to make of Castro. Obviously, a revolution in Cuba was not in our best interests, but we weren't quite sure exactly how bad it really was. And there is Castro coming to Washington, D.C., for example, shortly after taking over in Cuba. And then Castro does something pretty provocative. He nationalizes American-owned businesses, including sugar mills, in Cuba. Now, what it means to nationalize means that these American-owned businesses in Cuba were taken over by the Cuban government, and American businesses lost out on their property. It was basically just taken from them. And in response to this, President Eisenhower issued an embargo, and this embargo would stop all trade between America and Cuba. And this embargo still remains at least partly in place today. It's been weakened and lessened in the last decade or so, but pieces of these still remain. This is why Cuban cigars, for example, were illegal, and for all I know still are. I really don't know that much about buying cigars. Now, if the U.S. basically turned Castro down, we kind of turned our back and said, we're not interested in supporting you, we know who we can turn to. The second world, the Soviet Union. And so when the Soviet Union embraces Cuba, we go from concern to freaking out, because now we have a communist country just 90 miles off the coast of America. And we know that while Castro may not be a threat to us, the Soviet Union certainly is, and now the Soviets are teaming up with the Cubans. This was very, very concerning. That's Nikita Khrushchev. We talked about him in the past. We'll talk about him some more in our next video, because where this is going is something called the Cuban Missile Crisis. So to quickly review what we covered in this video, we looked at the three worlds model. The first world was the capitalist democratic world. Think of countries like America and Canada. The second world was the communist world. That would be places like the Soviet Union and China. And the third world was basically everybody else. And that everybody else, some countries didn't want to be part of the first or second. They were called the Nonaligned Movement. And then we looked at how Castro took over Cuba and turned it into a communist dictatorship that really, really concerned America.